Please do go ahead and sign in if you have not already. We will begin in a couple minutes. All right, just a couple of announcements as folks are still getting signed in. I just wanted to remind you all that your third exam was due last night by midnight. There are a few folks who have not yet completed that. If that applies to you, please do go ahead and get that done. I'll leave it open for another couple of days. But if you don't have it done, I'm going to go ahead and say by the end of this week, by Friday, I'm going to have to go ahead and assign a 0 for folks who haven't gotten that done. But there aren't too many people who haven't done it. So the exam was open book, and there was a strict time limit on the exam. So for those of you who thought that the exam would be a breeze because it was open book and decided not to study for it, I warned you guys not to think that it was going to be easy because it was open book. I purposefully made the time limit very strict so you guys wouldn't have enough time to look up every single answer, so that it would put some constraint on the number of answers that you guys were able to look up. So this was the compromise that I went with, because I'm not able to use Respondus Lockdown Browser because a lot of you guys are completing the course from a tablet or a phone. So I couldn't use Respondus Lockdown Browser. So there's nothing that I could do to prevent you guys from looking up your answers. So in order to make up for that, I put a tight time limit on the exam so that you wouldn't have time to look up every single answer. So the average grade on the exam was a 78%, which was about the same as we usually see with most of my exams that have been given in class. So I think it worked out pretty well. There were a few folks who probably scored below what they would have liked. But I will say that this provides an incentive to everyone on the last exam, on the final. Now you know that the exam is not just going to be super easy just because it's open book, and that you do actually have to watch all of the lectures. You do actually have to read the chapters. You do actually have to study. So if you have an ADA accommodation for extra time on the exam, I would be glad to make sure that that's activated for you. Just please be sure to let me know. And there are a couple of extra credit opportunities to get some points back for those of you who maybe scored a little bit lower than you would have liked. I think maybe I will make one more extra credit opportunity. I haven't thought of what it's going to be just yet, but right now we have the extra credit discussion on gender open and the psychology and film. Each one of those is worth 5 points. So that's 10 points of extra credit that you could get back if you had a bad day on the third exam. And I'm thinking of also making one more final extra credit opportunity worth another 5 points, so that there would be 15 points of extra credit. So if you had a bad day on that exam or any other exam, you could get 15 points back at least, to at least try to offset that a little bit. So I know 16 minutes was a really, and I see some comments here. I see a comment that said that, says that I felt like an hour was not enough time. I understand that perspective, but I felt like this was the only thing that I could do to beef up the test security, so that it didn't give everybody the opportunity to just look up every single answer. I do, like I said, I want to try to make it so that you still have to study and you still have to spend some time with the material prior to the exam to do well on it, so that you can't just look up every single answer. So that's the reason why I put such a strict time limit on it. But again, we have these extra credit opportunities, and we'll have one more that I will open up. So hopefully you guys will take advantage of that opportunity to maybe offset a bad grade on that exam. So what other announcements do I have here? Second essay, I'm still working on those. And that's another point of encouragement for those of you who maybe had a rough day on the third exam. I tend to be pretty easygoing on grading the essays, and you guys should see a grade for Essay 2 coming out here pretty soon. So I know I'm a little bit behind on that. And for those of you who are in my honors component, I do know also that I'm a little bit behind on getting my honors course updated. I think that applies to a couple of you guys. So I appreciate everybody's patience. Working from home has thrown me off quite a bit, and it's made it much more difficult to get everything done in a timely manner, because there's so many distractions at home and so many things here that have just thrown me off with this whole thing. So I appreciate everybody's patience, and we'll go ahead and continue our chapter 12 lecture. We're in the middle of chapter 12, which is on the topic of social psychology. All right, so like I said, we're in the middle of chapter 12 on the topic of social psychology. And let me go ahead and get those slides pulled up. And while I'm doing that, if there's anybody who has not signed in yet, please go ahead and do so. All right, so last time when we left off in chapter 12, we were talking about attitudes. And this is a topic that social psychologists like to study. Most of the relevant literature on attitudes and attitude change has been studied by social psychologists. And you guys should see a full screen view here of the chapter 12 slides. If not, somebody please let me know in the chat bar. So we have, like I said, most of the major literature on, thumbs up, cool. Most of the major literature on attitudes and attitude change has been the purview of social psychologists, because attitudes are actually something that are to at least a strong degree socially formed. So we were talking a little bit last time about cognitive dissonance, which is the disconnect that can sometimes occur between our attitudes and our behavior when we have a contradiction between maybe an attitude that we hold and a behavior that we engage in. I gave the example last time of folks who smoke, still knowing that smoking is bad for them, right? So a lot of times when you talk to smokers about the fact that smoking is bad for them, like I said last time, you'll hear them engage in all sorts of cognitive gymnastics to try to rationalize the fact that they smoke, right? You'll hear them make comments about, oh, well, you got to die one day, right? Or some folks eat a lot of meat. Some folks eat a lot of sweets. You know, this is my vice, right? You know, you don't give people a hard time about all the sugar that they eat. Actually, we do as a society. We know that that's bad for us, and we give people a hard time about that too. But these are just rationalizations that you'll often hear from folks to try to justify or to try to bring that those two discordant things into alignment so that you don't experience this discomfort that's caused by having this disconnect between one's attitudes and one's behaviors. And last time we talked a lot about the research that was done by Festinger on cognitive dissonance. And one type of cognitive dissonance that we talked about was post-decisional dissonance, which is the type of dissonance that occurs when we commit to a course of action, right? So if you have a choice to make between two pretty similar choices, let's say, you know, between two very similar cars that you're trying to buy, like the example that I gave last time. You make your choice, and then your brain will actually trick you into believing that you liked the choice that you went with more all along, right? It was always the better choice, even though at one point in time you saw them as equal choices. Once you commit to a choice, you'll actually start to believe that the choice that you went with, you always believed that that was the superior choice, right? So that's what's known as post-decisional dissonance. And we also talked about another type of cognitive dissonance that's known as insufficient justification of effort dissonance, which was illustrated by the classic $20 versus $1 study, as I like to call it, where you had research participants who were paid either $20 or $1 to lie to the next research participant about the study that they were about to participate in. And this was back in 1959, like I said. So in 1959, $20 was quite a lot of money. It'd be like almost $180 today. So you're being paid this really massive amount of money to lie to the next participant, or you're being paid a significantly smaller amount of money to lie to the next participant. And it turns out that the folks who had lied for the smaller amount of money to the next participant actually were able to trick themselves into believing the lie that they told the next participant, because they didn't want to think of themselves as the type of folks who would lie for $1. On the other hand, the folks who were told who told the lie for the much more substantial amount of money, those folks actually did not convince themselves of the lie that they were paid to tell, because in this case, they had a sufficient justification for the lie that they told. Well, of course I told the lie. I was paid this massive amount of money to tell the lie. Who wouldn't, right? That doesn't make me a bad person. I was just given an offer I couldn't refuse, so to speak. So that's what's known as insufficient justification of effort dissonance. And it's also the type of cognitive dissonance that explains why, for example, when folks are hazed to join an organization, let's say you're trying to join a fraternity, or maybe you're joining the military and you have to go through boot camp, or you're going into special forces as a service person and you have to go through an even more rigorous training. For that, it's kind of a form of hazing, right? Well, a lot of social psychology research has shown that people will actually be more enthusiastic and loyal to the organization after they've gone through a hazing compared to folks who don't have to go through a hazing to join the organization. And the idea is that folks don't want to think of themselves as the type of person that would go through all of this humiliation in order to join an organization that's not worth being a member of, right? So, or another way to look at it, to flip that around and say that, oh, I went through all of this effort, I went through all of this humiliation to join this organization, therefore this organization must be really something worth being a member of, right? If you get the logic. So that's where we left off last time. And for those of you who maybe missed the class meeting, I would encourage you to watch the recording of the class meeting. We're going to continue talking about attitudes a little bit more in terms of attitude change. Any attempt to try to get someone to change their attitude about something is what's known as persuasion, right? So anytime you're consciously trying to get someone to change their mind about something, this is an attempt at persuasion. The active and conscious effort to change an attitude through the transmission of a message, okay? So when we look at the persuasiveness of a message, there are three broad types of factors that play into this. One is the source of the message. We tend to be more persuaded by certain types of messengers. For example, social psychology research has shown that we tend to be more persuaded by folks who we perceive as being similar to us in some way, folks we have something in common with, folks we can relate to. We also tend to be more convinced by folks we perceive as being experts, right? So if you perceive someone as having a high degree of competence in a particular area, then you're probably going to find them more persuasive, right? So if if Dale Earnhardt Jr., for example, narrates a car ad telling you, how good this new Chevy Monte Carlo is, you might find him to be a more persuasive messenger, say, than, Joe Schmo, who you've never heard of, right? Because Dale Earnhardt Jr. is known for his association with motorsports, right? So you might find him more persuasive, never mind the fact that they're probably paying him a substantial amount of money as well. But we tend to find folks who are similar to us more persuasive, folks who we find more competent, we find them more persuasive. And the content of the message itself, how was the message engineered? How convincing is the message itself? That's something we're going to come back to in a second when we talk about the elaboration likelihood model. So hold that thought. But the receiver of the message, you, the person receiving the message, this is another thing that affects how likely the message is to be persuasive, right? And this is something that social media has become really, really powerfully good at. So really, when you look at social media, the way that they make their money is by using your information that you provide to them. It feels like things like Instagram and Facebook are free because we're not charged any money to use them. But where those companies make massive amounts of money, companies like Facebook, Twitter, etc., all these social media companies, the way they make their money is by using the information that you provide them to target you with ads that advertisers pay a pretty penny to target you with, right? So based upon every like that you've ever clicked, every thumbs down, every smile emoji, every wow emoji, every angry face emoji, every group that you followed, every celebrity that you followed, every friend that you have, every quiz that you've ever taken on Facebook, every single data point that you've ever provided them is a data point that they use to target you with advertisements that are going to be particularly persuasive to you based upon the data that you've given them. CJ says, don't forget they also follow what you do off their website. Exactly. Yeah, and that's huge. A lot of people don't realize that. But have you ever noticed that this happens to me all the time? If you Google something, then within minutes, the same day at least, at the latest, the thing that you Googled, you start to get ads for in your Facebook feed. That's because they're following your cookies, right? And they know what you're looking at outside of Facebook. They actually know what you're doing on your computer outside of Facebook, which is really kind of scary and creepy when you think about it, but that's what you sign up for when you use Facebook. So it's not free. What you're providing them with is your data. You don't even have to search for it, CJ says. You could just talk about it near your phone. Yeah, I've heard that too. I haven't experienced that consciously, but maybe I haven't known it. But I know just yesterday, for example, I was looking up a podcast episode by Sam Harris, who is a podcast guy that I like to listen to sometimes. And some of you may have heard of him before. He's a famous author. But I was looking up this particular podcast episode of Sam Harris's, and I was looking up the podcast episode on YouTube that I ended up listening to. And later that day, I started getting Facebook ads to follow Sam Harris on Facebook. And I actually ended up doing it. And I'm like, oh, wow, I didn't realize I wasn't following him. And I followed him. And I knew that I was giving into to their ad, but he's actually someone that I wanted to follow who I wasn't. So I followed him, but they gave me that prompt to follow his Facebook page after I had searched for one of his podcast episodes on YouTube, right? So that sort of thing happens all the time. And it almost feels like they're reading your mind sometimes. And in a way they are, because they're reading your mind through your behaviors on the internet. And that's all about the receiver of the message. They have this mountain of data about you, and they know which ads you, the receiver of the message, are going to be most receptive to due to all of the data that you've provided them. Okay, so I said I would come back to the content of the message, and a particular model that is relevant to the elaboration likelihood model is the central, okay, I'm sorry. I got to get my thoughts straight here. Crazy Monday morning. A particular model that is relevant to looking at the content of the message, rather, is the elaboration likelihood model, which looks at the content of the message through the framework of the likelihood that you are going to mentally engage with the content of the message, which they call this mental engagement elaboration. So you have two basic routes to persuasion according to this really popular model in social psychology, and this is used by marketers a lot. But you have the central route to persuasion, which actually involves assessing an argument of some kind. And you have the peripheral route to persuasion, which is more about classically conditioned association. So let me give you a couple of examples here. So let's say you're shopping for a new car, right? And you want a fast car, you want a muscle car, right? So let's say you see an ad on Facebook that's targeted at you based upon your search history, but it's a commercial for the new Ford Mustang that Ford Motor Company has put together. And as someone who's particularly into cars and someone who knows a little bit about engines, maybe you've even you have a mechanical background, and Facebook probably knows that about you, right? So they target you with an ad that is geared towards the central route to persuasion. So you get an ad from Ford Motor Company, which talks about all the mechanical specs of the new Ford Mustang, right? 5.0 liter engine, dual overhead cams, independent rear suspension, 0 to 60 in so many seconds, right? And you hear all these impressive things about how powerful the motor is and how impressive the car is mechanically overall, right? And the idea here is that you're being given information that you're expected to assess. And in this case, that information is geared at convincing you that this is a quality vehicle. This is a fast car. This is a mechanically sound vehicle that is going to, give you that jump off the line, so to speak, that you get when you press the pedal down, right? So that's the central route to persuasion, because you're being given information. In this case, it's basically an argument that this is the mechanically desirable vehicle, right? That would be basically an argument that you're essentially assessing. And that's a high elaboration model. So the central route is said to be high elaboration because there's actual information that you're expected to assess. So central route to persuasion, it's how convincing the message is a function of the quality of the argument and the information that you're given to support that argument. So the central route to persuasion is based upon argument. It's based on the quality of the argument. The peripheral route to persuasion is more about creating classically conditioned associations. Going back to the example of trying to sell the new Mustang, let's say instead of an ad that talks about how mechanically sound the car is, you get an ad that shows, the world's hottest couple, Ken and Barbie, or whatever hot is to you, right? That's subjective. But you've got Ken and Barbie driving down the Pacific Coast Highway, you know, in California, next to the mountains and the beach. They've got the top down, you know, and Barbie's wearing a bikini, and her hair is blowing in the wind as the top is down. And Ken is driving the car, and as his arms reach out for the steering wheel, his bulging biceps are showing, his nice chiseled jaw, you know, and his nice six-pack abs are showing, right, as they drive down the highway with no shirts on. And you've got this beautiful couple on the most beautiful day in the most beautiful place, enjoying all of this natural beauty. And the idea is that if you were to purchase a new Ford Mustang convertible, then you too could enjoy this beautiful life and have this sort of beautiful company. And there's a classically conditioned association that they're trying to make between the product and sex appeal, between beauty and enjoyment. You get the idea, right? There's no actual argument that's really being made in this case. They're just trying to create this classically conditioned association between sex appeal and this particular model car, right? So with the peripheral route to persuasion, they're not really engaging with an argument. They're giving you these cues that they're hoping that you create a classically conditioned association to, right? And we see this with all sorts of products. You know, maybe with a Ford Mustang convertible, it's, you know, beautiful, sexy people on the beach, right? What about beer? What sort of associations do advertisers try to make with beer? Anybody?
Good times. A lot of times they'll also have like sexual references as well.
Yep. Sports also, right? We've pretty much been brainwashed into believing as Americans that if you watch a baseball game or a football game without eating chicken wings and drinking beer, then you're a communist, right? Because if you're a good American, you know, any good American's going to eat chicken wings and drink beer while they're watching the ball game, right? And if you don't do that, you're a damn communist and you need to get out of my country, right? So that's, you know, I'm just kidding, but I don't drink, right? But that's the idea, that there's this association between alcohol and sports. Really, there's actually no association between alcohol and sports whatsoever, none. It's just an association that advertisers have created to make you think that if you're not drinking while you're watching the game, then you're not doing it right. You see what I'm saying? Can anybody else think of any other examples of this in advertisement? All right. Maybe perfume ads and hot celebrities, right? Brad Pitt is the male model, I think, for Chanel cologne, if I'm remembering correctly. And I think it's Charlize Theron that is the female spokesmodel for Dior, if I'm remembering correctly. You know, so there's these associations that they're trying to make. You buy this product and you know, you can have a good time like this. You can be sexy like this. You know, it's a, you know, really in reality there's no relationship whatsoever, but it's an association that's created by the advertisement, right? I guarantee you, if I put on Chanel cologne, I am not going to suddenly start experiencing life the way that Brad Pitt does, right? That is not going to happen. But that's kind of the implicit assumption that you're uncritically being asked to accept when you see a cologne ad with Brad Pitt, right? With his shirt off, you know, and probably some pretty actress hanging off of his side or something to that effect. Okay, so I want you guys to be familiar with the central route and peripheral route to persuasion as described by the elaboration likelihood model. At this point, we're going to segue into social influence, right? So we've talked a lot about attitudes up to this point in the chapter, but I want to switch now to looking at the ways that other people affect our behavior more broadly. This is often referred to as social influence or group influence. And just about everything else that we're going to look at in this chapter is going to relate to group influence in some way or fashion. And I am anticipating that we'll probably have to spend a third day on this chapter. I don't think 2 days was enough, so we'll probably get slightly behind schedule. That's okay, I'll get us caught up eventually. But there's just a lot of material in this chapter that that is really foundational in psychology. Social psychology is a huge area. So, and I'm not even covering all the topics in the chapter. But we'll probably have to spend at least another half a class meeting on this chapter next time. So now we're going to talk a little bit about group influence. And again, these are the various ways that other people influence our behavior. And this is perhaps the single most important lesson of all social psychology, is that other people affect our behavior in ways that we often aren't even aware of, in ways that, that we underestimate. The power of the social situation is very powerful indeed. And that is one general take-home message that I would like for you guys to get out of chapter 12. So to begin with, let's talk about two pretty straightforward examples of group influence: social facilitation and social loafing. So I used to do a lot of running when I was in college, and I'm trying to get back to it a little bit, like I've talked about before. But I was kind of a running addict in my 20s, and I ran a lot of half marathons, and I ended up injuring myself, which ultimately led to me kind of not running as much as I used to. And it's kind of a nagging injury that stayed with me. But I used to do quite a lot of running. I'm talking 50 to 80 miles a week in my 20s. And one thing that I would experience on a regular basis when I would be training at the track, there was a track near my house, and I would go to run at the track late at night, often, or early in the morning. And in many times when I'd get there, I'd be the only one there, all right? But then somebody else would show up and start running as well after I got there. And what do you think would happen when I was joined by a second runner on the track? Anybody have a guess?
It made you want to try harder?
Yeah, I started running faster, right? Has anyone else had this experience as a runner, or as an athlete in general? Having someone else there makes you all of a sudden start pushing harder, whether it's lifting weights or whether it's running. Yeah, so a lot of you guys can relate to this. And I'd start running faster because oftentimes it was unconscious. I wasn't even aware that I was doing it. Now, sometimes I would consciously notice that the person was gaining on me and I'd speed up. But oftentimes it was just a subconscious sort of thing, right? And that's what's known as social facilitation, when the presence of other people enhances your performance. And it looks like a lot of you guys can relate to this, and maybe not just in athletics, but in many domains of life. Sometimes the presence of other people makes us more competitive and enhances our performance. On the other hand, there's another possible scenario called social loafing, which is the opposite. And that's, like you see on the picture on the right here, when the presence of other people actually leads to a decrease in performance. Has anybody ever experienced this with a group project? Anybody ever done a group project? Jessica has, where maybe you're the only person doing the work, or maybe you and one other group member are doing all the work, and then everybody else is just kind of sitting back and taking all the credit, right? Yeah, it looks like a lot of people can relate to this one. I know I can. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not big on group work in my classes. There's one group thing that I do in human growth and development, which relates to moral development. It's a little group activity that lasts about half an hour. But it's the only thing I've ever done as far as group work. I really am not a big fan of it, because as a student, I've experienced that just about every time, like many of you have said, and it's a big problem. And to me, it's just, I hate group work as a student. I hate doing it. And because I hate doing group work as a student, I tend not to assign it as an instructor. But I can't speak for every instructor at PSC. I know that not all instructors have that attitude, but I just loathe group assignments with every bone in my body. And I think many of you guys can relate to this. Maybe some of you guys like it. It's just, not my thing. But here we see a picture of social loafing, right? got one person just sitting back and letting other people pick up all of the slack. So that's those are relatively simple examples, social facilitation and social loafing. Those are pretty simple, straightforward examples of how other people can affect our performance on a task. But I want to talk a little bit about a more insidious form of social influence or group influence known as de-individuation. And this is the type of social influence that was studied in the famous Stanford prison experiment. And I have a TED talk that I'm going to play for you guys here in a minute on the Stanford prison experiment. And I figured out how to make the audio work properly when sharing videos through Zoom. So thankfully I can start using videos in class again, which I like to do, as you guys know. So I'm glad I figured that out finally. The video might end up a little bit choppy, but the audio should be good. It should come through pretty well. So the Stanford prison experiment was the classic experiment that illustrated de-individuation. De-individuation is what happens when you enter a state of reduced self-awareness as a result of the role that you're playing within a group. Your self-awareness drops substantially. And in fact, your own individuality starts to be lost to the role that you're playing. De-individuation is actually what basic training relies upon. Has anybody in here ever been through basic training in the military? Anyone? Anybody been through basic? And would you agree that in basic training, one of the things that's being accomplished is kind of getting rid of your individuality? Of course, you're being taught how to shoot a gun. They're getting you into better physical shape. Of course, that's one of the goals. Those are some of the goals. But one of the psychological goals is to make you psychologically willing to die following orders, right? You can't be concerned with your own individual survival as much. When you're in the military, you got to be ready for a combat situation where you are willing to give your life for the people around you and for your country. You're a team, not an individual, as Jessica says, right? So one of the big goals of basic training is de-individuation. And how do they accomplish this? Through a lot of means, and maybe some that I'm even forgetting. But for one, you get a haircut, right? Everybody gets the same haircut, and it's the buzz cut that you get right before training. And I think the hair requirements for females might be slightly different, but everybody has the same grooming rules. Everybody wears the same uniform. Everybody sleeps on identical bunk beds. Everybody wears the same glasses. What do they call them? Birth control glasses, right? Because you ain't going to be having any kids wearing those, right? That's what I've heard them called anyway. But everybody looks the same. Everybody does the same thing. Everybody gets up at the same time. Everybody eats at the same time. All of this is geared towards eroding your own sense of individuality. And this is necessary to get you into that team mentality that Jessica is describing, right? So I'm not saying that de-individuation is always bad. On the contrary, we wouldn't be able to have a military without de-individuation. We wouldn't be able to arguably, in any sort of armed force or police force or any sort of organization that's dedicated to public safety where you have to put your own life at risk, some degree of de-individuation is necessary in order to get people to do that stuff, right? So de-individuation has a role to play, and I'm not aiming to say that it's always bad, but there is a possible dark side to de-individuation, and that's when you get people willing to follow orders or get people willing to behave in ways that they would consider morally reprehensible on their own, right? So that's the dark side of de-individuation. And the classic experimental example of this was the Stanford prison experiment. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the TED Talk that I have for you guys on that. We're going to take a look at that. Give me a second to get that pulled up. I meant to have it ready for you guys, but I forgot here. So I do want to mention that in this TED Talk, Philip Zimbardo, who was the guy behind the Stanford prison experiment, he also did the Discovering Psychology video series that I played a couple episodes of earlier in the semester. So you'll recognize him. He's a little bit older now, as you'll see. There are some disturbing images shown in this TED Talk because it relates to the Stanford prison experiment, and it also relates to a real life crisis, scandal, rather, I would say, that happened in the mid-2000s. There was a scandal called the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, which involved several military police behaving in a way, I don't know if they were actually military police. I think they might have, I don't know exactly what their MOS and rank was, but these were folks who were running a military prison in Iraq, and there was some mistreatment of some of the folks they had in custody there that occurred. And some photographs were taken of that mistreatment. And some of these photographs are quite disturbing. And they are shown, some of these photographs are shown in the TED Talk because Zimbardo relates the Stanford prison experiment to the Abu Ghraib prison scandal that happened, I'm gonna say back in 2004 or 5, if I'm remembering correctly. So he does show several of those disturbing images. And if you don't wanna look at that, he'll issue a trigger warning right before he's going to show them. And if that's going to bother you, then I might suggest looking away while that's happening, and he'll start talking again when it's over, so then you can look again when he's finished showing the images. But if that's going to be problematic for you, he does issue a warning. I also welcome discussion of the video while the video is going on in the chat box, if anybody has any reactions to what they're seeing or hearing, or if anybody can relate any of the things that he's talking about to things that you've observed in real life, feel free to chime in the chat while we're watching the video. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and share the video now, and then we can discuss it a little bit afterwards.
Just ignored what was going on around them. And when it came to light what actually was happening, they all seemed shocked, even though they knew it was happening. And they allowed it to happen.
Yeah, just obeying orders. That was the common defense that was given by the high Nazi officers at the Nuremberg trial. They were just obeying orders. All right, I was having some issues here with my sharing of the PowerPoints. We should be back to a full screen view here of the slides. Someone let me know if that's not the case. Julia says, monkey see, monkey do. Humans have the ability to do anything, they just need a push. Yeah, and I think a lot of us underestimate how capable we are of behaving in such a way. And we'll see more of this next time when we talk about the Milgram shock experiment, which Zimbardo referenced in that TED Talk. And for those of you who are watching the recording of this session, I had to pause the recording during the TED Talk because it's a copyrighted TED Talk. So that's why there's a gap there in the recording, and it goes straight to this after I say we're about to watch the TED Talk. You'll be like, what TED Talk? So if you're watching the recording of the class session, you will need to go to TED.com and watch the TED Talk by Philip Zimbardo on the Stanford prison experiment. It's pretty easy to find. CJ says, I believe I've seen a video about that experiment. Yeah, it's pretty famous. There's also been, I think, a few Hollywood movies that have been made about it over the years. I'm not sure how sensationalized those movies have been. Brianna says, that I think there's a herd mentality too. If others are okay with it, why wouldn't you? It's like the man said, he didn't see a problem until someone else outside the herd mentioned it. And that gets to the topic of conformity also, which we'll talk about also next time. The last thing that I want to talk about today, and you guys make some great points. The last thing I want to talk a little bit about is groupthink and some related concepts to groupthink. So when folks get into groups, many of you may have noticed that that when folks get into groups, they often behave in ways that they wouldn't by themselves, right? Folks in groups have a tendency to behave in more risky ways than any one individual member of that group would on their own. And this is what's known as the risky shift effect. There's also a tendency that groups have to coalesce around the extremes. So for example, if you get a bunch of conservatives together or you get a bunch of liberals together, those like-minded members of that group will become even more conservative as a group than any one member of the group probably is, or will become more liberal than any one member of the group individually is. The group itself will become more extreme than the individuals who comprise the group, if that makes sense. And we see a lot of this in the political landscape. So that's why I use conservatives and liberals as an example of this. And this is what's known as group polarization, when like-minded groups of people tend to coalesce around the extreme view. And this can lead to what's known as groupthink in extreme cases. And I see a comment here. Why do they have to push them to do evil like in the prison experiments? Why not push them to do good? Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. And I think these forces can be used for good, right? So these forces are not necessarily good or evil on their own. It's the way in which they're utilized. So you can use de-individuation, like I said earlier, as a force for good in the military and basic training and getting people to behave in a more group-oriented way. You know, de-individuation is the process by which people become willing to give their lives for their country, right? So these processes can be used for good. There's a reason our founding fathers didn't choose a direct democracy, like CJ said. Yeah, and that's a fair point. A lot of folks don't realize that we actually live in a republic, not a direct democracy, which is I think a lot of mistake a lot of folks make. We don't live in a direct democracy. We live in a republic, which means that we elect leaders to make these decisions for us, who hopefully represent our interests. Mob rule hardly leads to good decisions. Yeah, and that's a point that relates directly to the concept of groupthink, which is the last concept that I'm going to talk about today because we're running out of time. But like I said, group polarization happens when groups coalesce around the extreme view, right? And an extreme form of group polarization is basically what we call groupthink, or it's this tendency that people have to quit thinking for themselves when they become part of a group. And again, this relates to the Stanford prison experiment as well. But folks will sometimes have a tendency to quit thinking for themselves and will just go with what the group wants to do. And this relates to conformity as well. You know, a lot of these concepts kind of relate to each other. But when you stop thinking for yourself, when members of the group stop thinking for themselves and the group mentality just takes over, that's what we call groupthink. And a classic example of this that you'll often hear about was the Challenger disaster that took place back in 1986. I was only 2 years old when it happened, so I don't remember it, but you can go on YouTube and you can watch videos of the space shuttle Challenger exploding on takeoff, killing everyone aboard. It was a national tragedy at the time, and everybody watched it happen on national television. Can you imagine being a family member of someone aboard, right, and watching that live on TV? It was really traumatic. But the ultimate cause of the Challenger disaster is usually traced back to groupthink. Of course, it was a mechanical failure that led to the disaster, but the members of the group at NASA who were responsible for making this decision were under tremendous pressure to have a successful launch, because they had to cancel the last couple of launches due to bad weather. So they were embarrassed by that, and they wanted to have a successful launch. And you know, there was the external threat of NASA embarrassing itself if it had to cancel yet another launch. And there was always the possibility that they could lose funding from Congress if they kept having to cancel launches. So they had this strong bias to want to go through with the launch, right? Even though there were several engineers, at least a handful of engineers, that were aware of the fact that there was this mechanical problem that could cause a risky situation in bad weather, which was the case on that day. But those engineers ignored that problem because they didn't speak up. They didn't say, hey, we need to cancel this launch and fix this, because they didn't want to be that person that spoke up. They didn't want to be the buzzkill that spoke up and said, hey, we need to cancel this launch, right? They didn't want to be the person that everybody goes, oh man, right? They didn't want to be that person, right? So they didn't speak up. That's the power of groupthink. So they went through with the launch. And the engineers who were aware of this problem didn't speak up. And the result of that was the death of everybody on board the ship on takeoff. And it was a national tragedy. And we can ultimately thank groupthink for the occurrence of that event. You can read about that in the history books, and that's the common conclusion that's been drawn. Okay, so next time we will continue with the topic of conformity, like I just mentioned, and we'll talk a little bit more about the Milgram shock experiment on obedience. We'll talk about the bystander effect. I have a few more things I want to talk about in this chapter, so we're going to spend a little more time on it than planned. That's okay. We'll get caught up eventually. We always do. So I hope everybody enjoyed the class meeting. And if you have any questions or you need to follow up with me about anything, please do email me. We can always schedule a private Zoom meeting. I got to get ready for my next class that starts at 11. So I hope that everybody has a good afternoon. And if you have not signed in through the chat, please do so if you have not already. Otherwise, you're free to sign out. I'm going to hang out for 30 seconds or so to let people sign in who haven't, and I will see you guys on Wednesday.